The Power of the Dog is the new film from Jane Campion, who hasn't directed a feature film since 2009. Set in 1925 on a ranch in Montana, this is a postmodern western, a slow burn film that uses the genre to break down and examine ideas about traditional masculinity. It's based on a 1967 western novel by Thomas Savage and is widely considered to be his best work. Jane Campion has been described as a feminist filmmaker, though she's often resisted the label, not wanting to be restricted to making films where feminist ideology overshadows engaging storytelling. I've only seen one other film she directed, her most famous film, 1993's The Piano. She became the first female director to receive the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival with The Piano. It wasn't the kind of film I would have gone out of my way to see at the time. I saw it for an intro-level film class in college, but The Power of the Dog deals with some of the same themes involving the oppression of women by stubborn male forces. I don't think The Power of the Dog tops The Piano, but it's the welcome return of a veteran director. Campion's films have usually been centered around women, though The Power of the Dog is centered around a mostly male cast. Its lead performance of the aggressive and homophobic lead rancher Phil by Benedict Cumberbatch is the centerpiece of the film, but I still don't know how I feel about his American Western accent.
Give her half a chance and she'll be after some dollars for Miss Nancy's college fee.
I don't know, maybe this is because I'm used to seeing Cumberbatch do distinctively British roles like Sherlock Holmes and Alan Turing. Phil's brother George, played by Jesse Plemons, is the yin to his brother's yang. He's kind, introspective, and passive. Does this make him the beta cuck to Cumberbatch's alpha Chad? Phil resents his brother George's marriage to Kirsten Dunst's Rose character, so he goes out of his way to terrorize her whenever he can. In The Piano, Sam Neill's character is a controlling, abusive masculine presence, while Harvey Keitel is the more compassionate male character with whom the oppressed Holly Hunter falls in love with. Speaking of Harvey Keitel, in The Piano, he went full frontal nude for that movie. Talk about commitment to a role. Thinking back to watching The Piano for an intro-level film class, I bet there was someone in that screening that was thinking to themselves, is it too late to drop this class? There was media buzz about Cumberbatch's full frontal nude scene in The Power of the Dog, but if that's the reason you're watching the movie, it might be kind of a letdown. Sure, we get a gratuitous butt shot of Benedict Cumberbatch covered in mud, but his cumberjunk only flops onto screen for a few frames. If you went into this movie solely on the promise of full frontal male nudity, then yeah, you'll be let down. This is directed by a woman though, so there are 2 different scenes where naked or shirtless cowboys lounge and frolic around, if that's what you're into. The whole idea of a Western that reframes the genre around the toxic masculinity of its lead is immediately going to be off-putting for some viewers who might not be willing to accept a film that critiques traditional gender roles through the crude and violent nature of its main character. Cumberbatch gives a compassionate enough performance to make his character tragic as well as antagonistic, so I think it's a nuanced take on the tough male Western stereotype. I don't think this film is outright attacking masculinity as much as it is dissecting and examining it, the way Rose's son Peter dissects animals in the film. The Power of the Dog is also a great-looking film, just beautifully lit and shot in Jane Campion's home of New Zealand. The establishing shots are gorgeous, conveying the grand nature of these huge open spaces associated with Western films. Though, in the end, the film is dragged down by a slow burn pacing that is more about exploring themes than progressing story. I would have liked to see a tighter edit, though I did actually enjoy the ending. I found there to be pacing issues that caused the film to drag until about halfway through. Basically, I found the most interesting scenes to be in the second half of the film, with a lot of build-up to get there. The Johnny Greenwood score is fantastic. It builds tension appropriately with an abundance of discordant sounds. the score might actually be my favorite element of the film. There's beautiful guitar picking and menacing strings that carry the film from one scene to the next. There are also unsettling piano passages that introduce the character of Peter as he precisely builds flowers out of cut-up sheet music. Diegetic music is also integral to the film, as Phil uses his banjo playing to aggressively taunt Rose while she prepares for a piano recital. In order to make my point, I need to talk about these scenes in detail, so we'll get into spoilers. This movie is worth watching if what I've told you so far sounds intriguing. However, if the idea of a postmodern Western that deconstructs and criticizes quote-unquote toxic masculinity sounds like a terrible way to spend 2 hours, hey, I get it. On paper, it sounds kind of annoying, but I had a favorable opinion of the film, albeit with some significant critiques. Despite how good some scenes look and sound, there are issues I have with the execution of the story. The piano scene is supposed to explain why Rose turns to booze and becomes a lush, but it didn't make that much sense to me. I get what they're going for. Phil is an overbearing and cruel masculine presence, and he drives his sister-in-law into alcoholism through his behavior towards her and her son from a previous marriage, Peter. George marries Rose, and he suggests that she play the piano at a gathering for his parents. She responds 2 different times that she's not that good, and she doesn't really want to do it. George brings in a piano anyway, and when Rose is trying to practice, Phil mocks her practice with his banjo playing. He's also really good at his instrument. Rose steps out into a field and cries over some beautiful non-diegetic string work. When the gathering happens, she freezes up and can't play. Phil comes in the room and taunts her while whistling. She picks up a drink. Later, he peers down on her while whistling this melody again as she chugs liquor in an alleyway. This series of events just doesn't seem to play out that realistically for me. Her brother-in-law is a jerk, and he interrupts her piano practice, so she becomes an alcoholic. Yeah, I'm being a little reductive here, sure, and I understand the character arc they were going for, but I think it could have been executed a little better with more scenes that show Phil subtly grinding down Rose's resolve over time. Rose ends up being a little one note here, though I didn't think it was a bad performance from Dunst. She was just the typical unstable woman stereotype, but it was all the fault of men around her. Jesse Plemons as George is in a very understated role here, and the scenes in the first half of the film that set up his marriage to Rose take up a little too much time in my opinion. I think the most engaging scenes are later, the ones with Phil and Rose's son Peter. Peter is quiet and introspective. He likes flowers and cutting open dead animals. His demeanor doesn't line up with Phil's conventional ideas about masculinity, so Phil taunts and degrades Peter. There's symbolism that might be a little too obvious in the scene where Phil uses the flower that Peter has made to light his cigar. He says something along the lines of, "Look at that pretty flower." It's the idea that Phil destroys things that are beautiful and fragile because that's what he thinks strong men are supposed to do. Phil and George had a mentor when they were children named Bronco Henry, and everyone in this movie is always talking about Bronco Henry.
People helped you, fatso. One person in particular taught you and me ranching, so we damn well succeeded.
When Phil later becomes a mentor to Peter, Peter finds a collection of nude male photos with the name Bronco Henry attached. It's suggested that Phil was sexually abused by Bronco Henry as a child, though he mistakes this abuse for love. Phil's extreme masculine nature is how he copes with this. He holds Bronco Henry in high reverence.
Bronco kept me alive by lying body against body in a bedroll.
There's a scene earlier in the film where Phil is reminiscing of early sexual exploits that George seems more ashamed of. He says, "Remember how the old lady brought those girls out to the ranch as soon as we could get hard-ons? Remember the tomato soup queen?" Which sounds like an unsettling reference to taking a girl's virginity. Then he comments on how you could have taken her out without putting a sack on her head. Phil comes across as really creepy and misogynistic. Perhaps a little over the top, but I think Cumberbatch pulls it off. Phil also frequently calls his brother fatso and beats up a horse. He's generally an asshole, but a compelling character. Okay, let's talk about the ending. Peter grows close to Phil in the second part of the film, so that he can murder Phil, who has driven his mother into alcoholism. Peter is a possible psychopath. Most serial killers start off by killing animals, and Peter breaks a bunny's neck without flinching. Peter doesn't have Phil's raw strength. He's waifish and awkward, but he dissects animals and studies them, so he understands how disease works. He finds an animal that has died from anthrax and gives the hides to Phil, who dies off-screen shortly thereafter. His beard, a sign of his masculinity, is shaved off before he is buried. This all makes Phil a tragic character. Peter basically puts Phil out of his misery, just like in the scene where he calmly breaks the bunny's neck. Phil is like a rabid or wounded animal, transformed so heavily by his trauma that he can now only lash out and hurt those around him. The title of the film, The Power of the Dog, must refer to the scenes where Phil is staring at the rolling hills, which to him look like a dog, yet none of the other ranchers see this. In a scene later in the film, Peter immediately sees the dog. Bronco Henry also saw the dog.
Come on, Phil, what is it? There is something there, right?
Not if you can't see it, there ain't.
Why could they see the dog when others couldn't? I think it has to do with them all being essentially the same. We don't know that much about Bronco Henry, except that he was this mythical masculine stereotype who clearly had a sexual relationship with Phil. Phil is a talented musician, so we know he's intelligent and creative, yet he downplays this side of his personality. Probably because when he was young, Bronco Henry attacked this side of Phil, the way Phil now aggressively manipulates Peter. It's a cycle of oppression built on ideas about how a man should act. I don't think it's quite as simple as men are dogs. The director's explanation of the title equates it to something like the id, our most base and primal urges. The title comes directly from a Bible verse, Psalms 22:20. "Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog," referring to the crucifixion of Christ. Peter reads this Bible quote after he has successfully killed Phil. Perhaps when he's reading this line, "Deliver my darling from the power of the dog," he's reading it more like "deliver my mother from the influence of Phil." I think that's how he's supposed to be reading it. I've gone back and forth on how I would rate this film. I'm thinking in the 6 to 7 range because I liked it, but I didn't love it. To be honest, this is a little outside of my wheelhouse. I'm really not into the closeted gay cowboy subgenre that much. I've never even seen Brokeback Mountain. The Power of the Dog is written and directed by an auteur filmmaker in her late 60s, so I kinda have to respect that. I like how unsettling the ending is, and the Johnny Greenwood score is so good. It's not one of my favorites from 2021, but it has some depth and beauty to it. 7 out of 10 seems a little high, and 6 out of 10 seems a little low. I don't really do half scores, so let's just round it up to 7. I forgot to even mention the scene where Peter blows off some steam by going outside and hula hooping. I guess nowadays you just blow off some steam by playing a video game, but back then You had to go outside and hula hoop.